you know, these changes that took place caused a lot of confusion, of course, because the Catholics that had been so devoted to the Mass recognized in these changes that they were the same changes that took place in the 16th century when England broke away from the Catholic religion. And so even back in the 1960s, there were Catholics who said, you're Protestantizing the Mass. The Mass is becoming Protestant. Now, they said this because you can just go through all the changes and you see almost every single one of them was something that Cranmer did in instituting the Anglican service in England in the 16th century after Henry VIII broke away. For instance, of course, the Latin was taken away. It was put into the vernacular. That was a Protestant change too. In the Catholic service, much of the service was quiet. That is, you couldn't hear the priest. The Mass was being celebrated as a sacrifice to God. The priest was offering it for the people. Much like in the Old Testament, when the high priest or just any of the priests went into the temple to offer sacrifice for the people, much of it was inaudible to the people that were assisting at it. They prayed and offered the sacrifice with their priest, but they couldn't hear all the prayers that he was saying. Now, when the Protestants in the 16th century instituted their religion and their services, they put all of it in a loud voice that it could be heard by everyone. And you'll see, even amongst Catholics today, that they don't understand this. They say, why can't the priest just say all of the Mass out loud? Why is it so quiet? Well, it's quiet because, as I said, the priest is praying to God. He's offering a sacrifice for the people to God. And God can hear whispers. But also, it keeps the reverence and the devotion. If everything is being sung or said out loud, there's no time for quiet. There's no time for recollection and peace. It's just there's a lot of noise. And that's why if you go or see a Protestant service, many people will comment on how, I've heard people say things such as, how does anyone pray at a Protestant service? Because everything is there's just all this noise. There's always music, there's always singing, and obviously when you sing, you're supposed to be praying. But the point is, there's no time for quiet and for recollection. And so the Catholic service, much of it was inaudible in former days. And now the Protestant service is entirely audible. Well, that's what the Novus Ordo did too. Now, the Catholic service also only had 2 readings, the Epistle and the Gospel. The Protestants had 3 readings. They added a reading usually from the Old Testament. Now, what did the Novus Ordo Church do? When the new Mass was promulgated, you'll notice that there are 3 readings, usually one from the Old Testament, an Epistle, and the Gospel. They adopted the same thing that the Protestants did. The Protestants also brought about the use of lay people to come up on the altar and to do the readings and to even preach or to administer communion. The Novus Ordo Church did the same thing. They invited lay people to come up to the altar, to give out communion, to do the readings at the Mass. And people started wondering, why isn't the priest doing it? And the priest in many churches would just take a seat. He would sit down as a layman came up to preach the sermon. And obviously that layman had been ordained as a deacon. But still, something was strange about the fact that your pastor just took a seat. It was very Protestant. Here it is. It's no longer the priest presiding over this. It is now the lay people. And it is the case in many Novus Ordo churches and parishes where the priests don't even do anything now. I think I was told here in this town that there's not even a pastor here, that there's a woman in charge of the parish. That's what I was told. I'm not sure if it's true, but that's what I was told. And so she does everything. She gives counseling, she gives out communion, she no doubt even, pretends to offer up some sort of ceremony and some sort of service. Obviously, she has no power to celebrate the Mass, but this is going on all over the world. And it's totally Protestant. The Catholic faith has always been a priestly religion. It's been led by priests who are ordained for that purpose. Priests who, of course, in the Western Church were never allowed to marry, to show that they are consecrated for the service of God in a special way. Now, also, the Catholic service was always celebrated on an altar built facing the east. All the Catholic churches that were constructed properly were built with the altar facing the east. And the altar was, of course, made out of stone because a sacrifice was being offered on that altar. Now, the Protestants in their services just have a table, if they even have that. And it's made out of wood. It's just a table that faces the congregation. The same thing now in the new church. The Novus Ordo Church adopted the use of a wooden table to face the people. Well, sometimes it's still made out of marble or stone, but many places it's just a wooden table that faces the people. Now, even on our old altars that were built out of wood, there was always a part of that altar that was made out of stone, and that's the part on which the sacrifice was performed. It's the center place of the altar. Now, some of you who have worked on altars or have been close up to an altar that's made out of wood, you'll know what I'm talking about. There is a hole cut out of the wood altar in the very center of the top of it, and they place in there, the bishop places in there, a stone. That stone has been consecrated for the sacrifice of the Mass. Now, the Novus Ordo Church doesn't do that anymore. Within that stone, relics were always placed. The relics of saints who were martyrs were always placed in that stone. Now, again, the Novus Ordo Church doesn't do that. Just like the Protestants, they no longer have this idea that the Mass is a sacrifice offered on an altar. Instead, the Novus Ordo Church, adopting Protestant practices, talks about the Mass being a meal or being a community celebration. Now, the Catholic service, Catholics would always go down on their knees. You stood and you knelt during the service. Pews weren't even needed in Europe. I mean, you go to Europe and you walk into these large basilicas, there's no pews. It's because Catholics stood and knelt during the service. Now, the Protestants did very little kneeling in their services that were brought about in the 16th century, and they received communion standing, whereas Catholics would kneel for communion, and also in the Protestant churches they would sit. And you'll hear Catholics today who speak about not understanding why in their old church, the pews were so uncomfortable. I heard a comedian talking like this. He was a Catholic or fallen away Catholic, and he was going on about, why, the pews were so uncomfortable. They gave you such little room to sit, and they were such straight back pews that, it was totally uncomfortable. Why not put some cushions on there? Well, it's because you weren't even supposed to really sit down. Not much. The Catholics always had in their services where you would kneel and you would stand and you would show reverence throughout the Mass. Sitting is a posture not very conducive to prayer. And now I don't want you to misunderstand me. There's nothing wrong with you sitting down in church and reading and praying, and of course there's nothing wrong with that.